Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Today, for this particular program, we've decided to recite this in the English language due to the fact that this is a very important matter, and it's a matter that's often neglected due to the ongoing tensions around the world and battles and wars taking precedence or priority over the crisis that's currently going on in Afghanistan. And it appears that more and more international news and media are diverting attentions towards Israel and Ukraine and everything that's going on around the world right now. The matter of Afghanistan started 2 years ago when the Taliban took over the country. It was a huge uproar back then when all of the news medias around the world were covering stories and everything, but now it appears that it's kind of being neglected, and all the crimes and issues that's going on in Afghanistan currently orchestrated by the Taliban government is no longer being broadcasted worldwide. So today we have taken this initiative to speak about the matter of Afghanistan in the English language in order to make sure that our international media and people who do not understand the Persian language that we usually create videos on so that they can become aware of the problems that are currently facing the South Asian and Central Asian territories. That is often neglected, as I said before, but it's hugely important and is directly related to the ongoing crisis in Ukraine and Israel and Gaza war. So I'll like to begin with the current situation in Afghanistan. So what is the current situation in Afghanistan? Well, Afghanistan is currently going through a very historical and crucial time, which will determine its future as a United States or perhaps and ultimately a partition. Unfortunately for Afghanistan, it was never in control of its own internal and external affairs, contrary to the nationalistic beliefs that many people within the country had. Historically, we've had limited control over our internal and external affairs, and even if we did have independent control over them, it did not last very long. Anyway, today, Afghanistan has yet again become a theater for change in the global power balance, a last stand between the Western powers and the Eastern powers that are currently rising, such as China, India, Russia, if you may consider them an Eastern power, and of course, Iran. The current ongoing world war that began in Ukraine and is currently intensified in Palestine, Afghanistan remains a decisive battlefield in the near future, which will ultimately decide the fate of the new world. Now, a lot of people, especially in the international media, or people who live in the West, or even people who live in the Middle East, usually do not see Afghanistan as a very crucial battlefield or theater in the world stage. But I can assure you that Afghanistan is where all this crisis began in 2001 when the United States invaded and occupied Afghanistan for about 20 years, fighting this very group that they have eventually made agreements with in Doha, eventually handing the government back to the Taliban. Anyway, currently, Afghanistan is under the rule of a group that's not independent and is not able to act according to its own will. Obviously, the Taliban came back to power after a conspiracy that was planned among the old Republic leaderships and the American and Pakistani intelligence based on their own interests that they had planned in the near future. The return of the Taliban marked the beginning of a new age of threats to the countries surrounding this geography. Of course, the objective was to increase the threat to these countries such as Iran, Russia, and China in the region, since they are rivals to the Americans worldwide, and the current ongoing world war that we're seeing in Palestine, Ukraine, and elsewhere is as a result of a united front that these countries have created against the Americans. The war in Ukraine was about to begin, and the superpowers of the world had been preparing to besiege the Americans in their regions of interest for a while. It had been 20 years since the United States invaded Afghanistan, and then later they invaded Iraq and established their bases across these regions, threatening the very countries that they today are fighting the Americans and their allies in the Middle East, Afghanistan, and Ukraine. But Iran is determined to push the Americans and its allies out of their power zone in the Middle East. China also aims to push the Americans out of the region surrounding the Chinese territories, as they believe the East China Sea and the South China Sea, and of course, American allies such as South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. And Russia, of course, aims to prevent NATO from reaching its borders and mobilizing a threatening force, such as the Ukrainians against the Russians, which historically have always proven a disastrous and weak point for the Russian power in Europe. So we did see the first move of this new world war, which was the return of the Taliban. A lot of people did not consider this as the beginning of this new shift of power towards a multipolar world, but it was the beginning of this whole world war that we are seeing right now. The return of the Taliban was the first move, and then of course the invasion of Ukraine. However, USA, they gave up their position in Afghanistan to the Taliban in exchange for a permanent threat to its rivals, where they can reincarnate terrorism and radical Islam near the borders of its rivals. Pakistan, obviously, as always, was assigned as the executioner of this plan, as they've always been. Now, Afghanistan has once again become a nest for international terrorist organizations under the management of the Pakistani intelligence, known as the ISI, and the Taliban as their puppets in Kabul. As per latest reports, the Taliban are mobilizing nearly 100,000 soldiers, and ever since their arrival in Kabul, the investments in madrasas, which are the religious schools, have increased drastically, which indicates that the project of radicalization has begun as planned. The radicalization of the people of Afghanistan will lead to a pool of fighting manpower that the Taliban could enlist into different terrorist organizations that are currently stationed across Afghanistan. Afghanistan is effectively becoming the largest military barrack in the world obviously for terrorist organizations, so they can enlist soldiers from the newly brainwashed and radicalized generation that the Taliban are currently creating. The plan is to raise as many radical soldiers as possible in Afghanistan so that there will no longer be a need to import these soldiers from Pakistan and Middle East and other regions where different terrorist groups operate, such as the ISIS. The objective of these movements are as simple as destabilizing Iran and Central Asian countries to the point where the US and Pakistan could exploit that instability so that they can turn the regions into what Syria and Iraq has been for the past decade or two, a war zone. The aim is not to only exploit the resources, obviously, and the strategical advantages of these regions, but to also threaten Russia's backyard, which is, of course, Central Asian territory. It is not only Russia's backyard, but it's also China's front yard and Iran's back door, which is Afghanistan. This is meant to intensify the threat of the Baluchi and the Sunnis in Iran, the threat of radical Islam in Central Asia, and the threat of East Turkestan in China, as we know them as the Uyghur people. But this plan so far seems to be having some opposite effects. Now, the other question here is, where is this crisis headed to? For such crisis, as I have mentioned, exists in Afghanistan. Taliban has been brought back to the power. The aim is for Pakistan and the US to destabilize the region in order to create more manpower for terrorist organizations currently stationed across northern Afghanistan in order to prepare them for the next phase of the plan, which is to export terrorism towards Iran and Central Asian countries in order to open a front against Russia, Iran, China, and of course India as well, given that these are the allies that are currently fighting in a united front against the US and their allies in Middle East and Europe and Africa and across the globe. So the current crisis, where is this headed to? Ever since the execution of the plan to bring back the Taliban into Kabul to reignite the radical war against American rivals around Afghanistan, contrary to expectations, it is Pakistan that is currently suffering the most. Now, why is Pakistan suffering so badly when it is one of the masterminds of this plan that was made during and before the Doha deal? Now, during the Doha deal, I would like to believe, not only would like to believe, I would like to predict or even analyze that Pakistan was involved in these deals secretly, which the Americans and the Taliban did not specify or did not reveal to the world. Pakistan does have strategic advantages in destabilizing Afghanistan. It always had, but this time they may have something more than just destabilizing Afghanistan. They may have geographical advantages that they may be expecting to exploit in northern Afghanistan. I'll explain that later. For now, Pakistan and the US have been strategic allies ever since the establishment of the Pakistani state. Even during the Cold War, despite the fact that India remains a democratic nation, India maintained a very close relationship with the Soviet Union because Pakistan had the US and the UK supporting it. When the war in Afghanistan was planned, it was determined that Pakistan will be the country that will create the Mujahideen under the instructions of the CIA and the MI6. Pakistan was heavily supported by the Americans, who were showering money and resources into Pakistan to fund the war against the Soviets in Afghanistan. It was a well-spent money and resources, obviously, which ultimately led to the victory for America and Pakistan, although the reasons for the Soviet collapse was much more than just a military disaster in Afghanistan. But Pakistan did achieve what it needed, which was to turn Afghanistan into a war-torn country, weakening its political structure and converting it into a region under the control of the ISI through different factions. However, soon after the fighting between different factions in Afghanistan and the eventual arrival of Taliban the first time in the 1990s, it became clear that Pakistan was not the only player in this war game. Iran, India, and even Russia, which had suffered a collapse years earlier, was committed to securing their own interests in Afghanistan, and they prevented a total collapse of the country into the hands of the Taliban, which could have been catastrophic even back then. The plan to transfer or export the war from Afghanistan into Central Asia and Iran would have come a lot sooner had they not intervened and prevented the Taliban from gaining a solo control of all of Afghanistan with no resistance. Now, Pakistan, despite being one of the crucial leaders of the return of the Taliban back to power in Afghanistan, seems to have descended into a crisis that is threatening its own future. The reason for this is the same that it was in the first Taliban rule in Afghanistan. It was, again, Russia, Iran, and India, which had prevented the Taliban earlier in the 1990s from taking over all of Afghanistan for the benefit of Pakistan. But now, these countries are now much more prepared and invested in preventing Pakistan from taking control of Afghanistan, because they know that this time the plan is to certainly export the war into their territories due to the ongoing world war. And if they fail, then the US will once again gain the upper hand and force these rivals to retreat. The way these regional powers are dealing with the Taliban threat in Afghanistan is different this time. Instead of focusing or investing in an anti-Taliban movement in Afghanistan, they are far more invested in exporting the war into Pakistan, which has been the plan since the US arrived in Afghanistan in 2001. The only way this threat can be averted is to target the source of the threat, which is Pakistan and its intelligence agency known as the ISI. Today, Pakistan is dealing with militants in the most important regions of its territory, Pashtunistan and the Baluchistan regions, of the two gates that connect Pakistan to the outer world, except for Sindh, of course, which is an exception. For now, however, in the long term, it is not out of the question that a crisis may arise in Sindh province as well, where which will threaten Pakistan's very existence as a powerful state. Pakistan's military is currently engaged with the TTP, Tehreek-e-Taliban of Pakistan, and the BLA, the Baluchistan Liberation Army, and other Baluchi militant groups in its own soil, and they have been suffering heavy casualties this year. These groups have been attacking military personnel and military bases across Pakistan, and these attacks have intensified dramatically, and this is not a coincidence. It is a very well-planned move by the regional powers that feel threatened by Pakistan's alignment with the US and its determination to continue to serve US interests in the region by increasing radicalism in Afghanistan and ultimately using it against the regional powers. Of course, Pakistan does not intend to serve US interests without having its own crucial interests. If Pakistan was not promised something in return, it would not be supporting America in its goals in Southern Asia. Of course, Pakistan would not have taken such a risk. As I said, Pakistan sees a crucial advantage which could determine its future in the region or even increase its power in the region or even worldwide. Now, Pakistan has been showered with money and resources for the past 40 years due to its role in the wars in Afghanistan, of course, for the benefit of its masters, such as the US and UK. Yet today they appear to be a very broken country in terms of economy, security, and are constantly asking for financial aid from the Arabs and the IMF. This is what a corrupt and puppet government leads to, and this is not something unpredicted by others, especially Indians who foresaw this crisis a very long time ago. And today their dream of a weakened Pakistan is slowly becoming a reality. Pakistan today has ended up in all kinds of crises, from political to security to economic. No doubt that their rivals such as Iran and India will deeply invest in increasing and intensifying these crises in Pakistan in order to finally bring about the collapse of the Pakistani state and drag it into a civil war. Well, it is something that Iran and India have a mutual interest in. Perhaps it is a mutual objective of both these countries, since Pakistan poses a threat to both equally. Pakistan's only hope here is, of course, China and US, who themselves are global rivals, but even they cannot fix the security problems that Pakistan is now facing, assuming they could fix the economic and political crisis. The security crisis in Pakistan is a result of Pakistan's own failed policy of raising terrorism and using them to change the geopolitical situation in the region, especially in Afghanistan, and their failed attempts to do the same in Kashmir. Terrorism continues in Kashmir region, but it will never reach the same level as Afghanistan because the Indians have been battling the ISI for far too long to fail to them miserably. Afghanistan, in contrast, was already a cracked state before US and Pakistan created the Mujahideen and the Taliban later. Internally, Afghanistan was suffering a strife of ethnic tensions and regional oppositions, mainly due to the policies of the Afghanistani government since the Great Game. So it was not very hard for Pakistan to exploit those weaknesses to create chaos for its own benefit. But today, Afghanistan is a weakened state and a nest for proxy wars among superpowers. Yet again, once again, the region of Afghanistan will be used to change the geopolitical situation in one of its neighboring regions. It could be Central Asia. It could be Iran. It could be naturally Pakistan. At the moment, as things stand, Pakistan does not seem to be quite enjoying this game so far. Now, the question arises, what happens when we are having such crisis, when everyone is fighting everyone? Who wins eventually? Well, I can tell one thing. It is impossible to maintain this status quo. Why is that? Because the current situation in Afghanistan will be very difficult to maintain due to the intense interventions from different powers who are currently engaged in a world war in Ukraine and Palestine. That is because Afghanistan is the hotbed of these crises that began 20 years ago with the US invasion. The war against US hegemony began after their arrival in Afghanistan and Iraq. The geopolitical situation in the Middle East and South Asia changed dramatically and for a short period of time. Despite suicide bombings and other attacks in Afghanistan, there was a little bit of light visible for the new generation of Afghanistan, a little light of hope that they might see, that they may have seen for a brighter future. But then again, of course, the perception of the regular citizens is different to the reality of the game that is played globally. They were once again obviously handed over to the demons known as the Taliban, and the torture and destruction began once again, far worse than it had previously, because the game is tougher on everyone this time around. This time, however, the Taliban is not just a pawn in Pakistan's hand, but rather different factions within the group serve the interests of different regional powers, except for the Haqqani group or Haqqani network, who are always in the service of the interests of Pakistan, because they are virtually ISI themselves. The plans that I have mentioned previously will require a certain degree of determination and chaos to be able to execute it effectively. Of course, the plans I spoke of was the plan to export terrorism and war towards Central Asia and Iran. If the plan to transfer the war or export the war towards those regions succeed, then it will not be without serious costs directly to the Pakistan and the US. Afghanistan is being prepared to become the most crucial battlefield of the ongoing world war, and Pakistan and US are once again aiming to test their fate in Afghanistan as they did 40 years ago when they began challenging the Soviets in this country. Once again, Afghanistan will become the theater of change in global power balance, but this time it will determine the fate of Pakistan in the region, and it might just end up with the dissolution of this Western Crusader state of Pakistan. For far too long, this country served as a bridgehead for the Western powers to invade Afghanistan and establish a presence in an Asian intersection known as Afghanistan. Of course, Afghanistan, I call it an intersection because it's in the middle of all those who rival America. Afghanistan geographically is located and borders Iran and China, and also regions that are under the influence of Russia, such as Central Asia, and of course, Pakistan benefiting from these crises and becoming a tougher opponent to India. But today it aims to do the same, but this time the players have increased. Of course, who is doing this is Pakistan. Pakistan is aiming to do the same again. They're trying to create the same crisis they had created 40 years ago, 20 years ago, and they are doing it again now. Iran, Russia, and India, and China even, are actively fighting the US in a unified front globally, and will do the same in Afghanistan since it is the most crucial battlefield than the rest of them, because Afghanistan is bordering all these countries, and a threat of terrorism in Afghanistan will create instability in regions affecting China, Iran, India, and Russia. And as I told you before, Central Asia is a very crucial and sensitive territory. Any form of war that will involve radical engagements will spread the war towards Russia, Iran, and even East Turkestan in China. And this is something that will not be allowed by these powers. If the Pakistani government and structure falls, then Pakistan will descend into a civil war with warlords erupting in different regions, particularly in Pashtunistan, Balochistan, Punjab, and Sindh. Each of them will have their own ideology, their own objectives, and this will bring chaos upon a region that is so highly populated. TTP will have its own Islamic Emirate government, Balochistan will have its own structure, Sindh will have its own structure, and Punjab may just be a continuation of the current Pakistani state, because Punjabis that predominantly control the military and intelligence in Pakistan today. Pakistan will then suffer the same fate that Afghanistan suffered during the Civil War, when different factions fought each other and destroyed the country for the benefit of Pakistan. Then we will see Indians, Chinese, and Iranians managing their own sides in Pakistan, and who knows how the conflict would end. The Pakistani state in its current form cannot continue to exist because it will simply always be a threat to the region due to its radical policies and terrorist foundations. If the region is to put an end to the threats in the region, they will have to destroy ISI and Pakistan in its current form and reinvent it in another form, or maybe partition it further. Pakistan will not be allowed to take Wakhan corridor. They will harbor terrorists in Afghanistan, and it will pose permanent threat to the regional security. Hence, to survive the chaos themselves, the regional powers such as Iran, China, Russia, India will have to work together to divert the chaos towards Pakistan and secure the Hindu Kush security belt that protects them. Afghanistan is the security belt that all these countries need to secure, and they will have to work together in order to achieve that. And the only way they can achieve that is to remove Pakistan, that will always consider Afghanistan the strategic depth of Pakistan and its interests, and that will serve only and only Pakistan and the US, and will neglect the interests of the rest. Of course, the matter of Pakistan, its interest in Afghanistan, and its alliance with the US and alliance with China require very deep studying and understanding, because Pakistan is a state that survived for more than 75 years, and it has been constantly receiving aid from different countries. Of course, Pakistan is basically not a state. It's just it's an enterprise that contains several different factories or companies, and they just produce terrorists, and then these terrorists are sold to the highest bidder. I will not be surprised if in the near future any plans against China was to be managed by ISI and the CIA. It may as well be funded by the Indians, because they share same rivalry with China. As I said, Pakistan is an enterprise that creates terrorism, but now 20 years in the 2023, there are many countries that are able to do the same, and it appears Pakistan is facing challenges that it from the same ideology, the same idea, or the same business initiative they had created themselves back 40 years ago with Mujahideen and the Taliban. Now they're facing the same threats with TTP, the BLA, and many other groups that are currently engaged in Pakistan and are being managed by the IRGC and RAW and FSB. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, this was the length of the program. Of course, this is not entirely everything. It will require further studying and further analysis and predictions. The reason I have presented this particular topic in English today is because I want the international community and people who are not from Afghanistan and the Persian-speaking nations to watch this, to understand that Afghanistan is a very crucial battlefield and it should not be neglected. And I know that the people of Afghanistan have been far forgotten, not now, but from 40 years ago when these wars were planned. And unfortunately, that is the reality of humanity and the world and the history. The message is clear. If the world wants to know if there is something left and human in the international community, then these things need to be considered, and they will have to work. They'll have to show something. They'll have to work towards ensuring that the people of Afghanistan are not forgotten and sent to destruction. But for the people of Afghanistan, there's only one way, and one way only. For survival, there is no other way left. You cannot plead anymore to anyone. You've pleaded for far too long. You've been pleading for half a century and even more, and no one's been listening. It appears that pleading was never an option. It was never the way. It was just a trick. And it appears that taking action is the only way. And I do not want to sound a very, very bloodthirsty person, but unfortunately, the war in Afghanistan will require a lot of blood, because the crisis that exists in Afghanistan are not one or two crises, but thousands of crises, and each crisis will only be averted through battlefield, through war, and bloodshed. Because if you continue to plead, a powerful force will continue to beat you, and no one will come to your rescue, because the world would only deal with the powerful and not with the weak. For Afghanistan, the only way forward, the only way to survival, if anything is left for survival, if anything is left to save, is through war. And war it must be. Thank you very much. Till we meet again.